go, man. Let's go. Pick it up.
Regina has hers in half.
Hornets in the hair. Rob, let's go. Rob, you can dunk in the air.
There's a prize involved, Rob.
Pick it up.
Sorry, I need gift cards.
Rob, she will have 2 in half before you get finished.
What's the last one? Mine, so I had to start over with the rest of the
Don't do it.
It's right here.
Okay, we're going to count down. And who's got theirs most done will be the winner. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, show me what you got. That's good. That's a good way. All right, we need a winner here. I think Reed, although I think Susan Thornton came first. Susan Thornton gets first. Reed McLean is second. Third, I think we have a third place winner on the floor. All right. Susan, you get your prize first. You get to go to the Wall of Weird. Whoa, baby! I said Wall of Weird. Draw a number from one of the Wall of Weird.
Alright.
Look at Rob Graham.
Who likes our Seriously Ridiculous videos? A little dance party here. Seriously Ridiculous games. Just some kind of random and odd stuff this summer. I don't think this will be distracting at all up here.
We're genius, don't worry.
Oh yeah, yeah, don't worry. You guys know everything, right?
That's all we're
That's right. Alright, well we're in this Seriously Ridiculous series this summer. So we're looking at gross, weird, scary kind of stories in the Bible, things that are just kind of outlandish, things that, yeah, not distracting at all. Really mature people heading off to college here. So this is the kind of stuff we're looking at this summer. And so the first week, does anybody remember what Travis talked about in week 1? Cicadas, yeah. What about the cicadas?
They're everywhere.
They were everywhere. We're glad they're gone. Yeah, Darcy? Yeah, I can't hear you. These guys are really loud in the front. What, Darcy?
Yeah, we are.
It was the plagues that Moses sent to Egypt.
Awesome, yeah, the plagues. And the plagues seem really, really seriously ridiculous, but the plagues had a lot of intentional purpose when God sent them. Each plague counteracts, as Travis talked about, a different pagan belief from that time. So there's actually a lot of purpose in that, which is really interesting. Last week, Allison, if you were here, who remembers what Allison talked about? She talked about a person. King Solomon. Very good, Angelique. King Solomon. King Solomon was one of the most wealthiest people, one of the people with the most power, the most money. But King Solomon was really unhappy for a long time because he was trying to fulfill his life with all of those things until he found God. Did he really receive any kind of true joy? And today we're going to look at the life of Rahab. Rahab in the Old Testament. But first, before we do that, I want to think about like our family trees. We all come from somewhere. We all have family trees. We all have people who've gone before us. And we think about family trees. Does anybody have anyone in their family tree that's just really weird, really strange, kind of strange cat? Yeah. What about anybody that you don't have to raise your hand for this, but sometimes you feel like your parents might be kind of like ashamed of, or they don't talk about them very much, kind of skeleton in the closet, your brother maybe, that Roger's making mention of. What about anybody have anyone kind of famous or heroic in their past and famous people? Yeah, awesome. When I think about kind of strange and weird from my family tree, the person that comes to mind for me when I think about family tree is my aunt. One of my aunts, I have two aunts. One is married but no kids, but they have a cat. Anybody know where I'm going with this? They have a cat, no children. And they pamper this cat. They do everything for this cat. They don't have kids, and they love their cat. And I love them. They're my family, but they're just kind of weird. They built this little like house for their cat. You know how people go on walks and they push their kids around in the stroller, take them on the walk with them? They take the cat with them on their walks in like a little stroller thing they've built for their cat. And then my uncle does a lot of Elvis impersonations. That's just one of his hobbies, and he loves it. And he's really great. He spends his time volunteering at nursing homes and places for elderly people, and he'll do shows and kind of do some entertainment. And he'll do his Elvis impersonations sometimes there and sing songs. That's really, really awesome. So maybe you guys can think of some people like that in your family tree. And when I thought about this and thinking about kind of the idea of maybe like, these aren't my aunt and uncle, definitely not skeletons in my closet. But when you think about that, it made me think of the movie Hitch. Has anybody seen the movie Hitch? Yeah. They go to, this is Will Smith is in this movie, and his character is taking Eva Mendes, Sarah, to Ellis Island, and he wants to surprise her. If you guys have seen the movie, you probably know where I'm going with this. He wants to surprise her, and he's really excited about it. Thinks it's going to be really great. He knows that her great-great-grandfather crossed over, immigrated to the United States, and he pulls open this book. The ledger is open specifically to the name, and she looks down at the book and starts kind of whimpering. She's like, and he's like, oh, this is great. This is really going to impress her. And then she just kind of starts bawling and freaking out and like steps back, and I don't know if you guys remember, and he's like, that was going to play differently in my head. That turned out a little differently than I thought that was going to. And she tells the story of how he's a butcher of Cadiz, and Will Smith thought that meant butcher in a butcher shop, but is a butcher of other things. A really, really kind of bad guy. And she ends the story with saying, yeah, my family never wanted to talk about that, never saw him ever again, except for on the wanted posters. And he's like, huh. It's not what I thought was going to happen here. He thought it was really going to impress her. But she had this skeleton in her closet that somebody in their family never talked about. But all of us have family history. Maybe not as exciting and kind of crazy as that, but we all come from somewhere. We all have this lineage. And Jesus' story, Jesus Christ, has a pretty interesting and very, very diverse family history. And Rahab, who I said we're going to talk about today, is part of Jesus' lineage. But does anyone else know kind of what the other thing is that Rahab's really famous for being? She was a prostitute, yeah. Rahab was a prostitute. She's in the Old Testament, not mentioned a whole lot, but she was a prostitute. And this is somebody who's a blemish on Jesus' mark, on his ancestry, but he's not ashamed at all because of the remarkable story that she lived. So Rahab's story is found in Joshua 2, and I'm going to kind of look at, I'm just going to kind of give an overview of Joshua chapters 1 to 6. And our setting for Joshua is in the city of Jericho, and this is about 3,500 years ago. And we can discern when you look at the first part of this scripture that Rahab was a prostitute because of poverty, that her family was just so poor. And without money in biblical days and ancient days, it was hard to get ahead, especially for a woman. If you had no money and you were female, you just about had no hope of really ever achieving or ever getting anywhere, of ever doing anything. And if your family had debt, you were just about indebted to people for the rest of your life in ancient days. It's not like we talk about today in the United States and kind of the idea of the American dream. There was none of that in ancient days. You couldn't get ahead, especially for women. So she was a prostitute just so that they could make some type of money for their family, not to condone her behavior, but that's why. That's what was going on. We talked a lot about that kind of forced labor in the Justice Mission series, if you guys remember, just before Rock the Chains. And there's still a lot of prostitution that goes on today, but a lot of times it is forced. A lot of times people are kidnapped or deceived into doing that. So that isn't quite what's going on with Rahab. Her family is just in extreme poverty. So she's living in the city of Jericho, and this is where you can see Jericho is really close to Israel. And Jericho is a fortified city, meaning it had huge walls built up around its city to protect it from invasions, from armies coming in. And it wasn't uncommon, it's actually quite common for people to live inside the city walls. They were so thick that there was room for people to live inside the city walls. If you think about living in a city that's got walls all the way around blocking the city, what's scarce? What do you not have much of? Land. Like you can't expand. You can only build what's inside those walls. And so there's actually room physically inside the walls of the city where people actually lived. Nobody wanted to live there, but people exploited it. Rent was cheap, and so a lot of times people who were in extreme poverty, like people who prostitute themselves because that's all they could do to get money, often maybe lived in those walls. And so Rahab, we know, lived near the city gates. And also going on during this time period, about 40 years before, was the death of Moses, and God's promising to the people to receive the promised land to the Israelites. And after Moses' death, God appoints who to the people? Does anybody know? Starts with a J? Joshua. Yeah, so God appoints Joshua to take over after Moses is leading the people, the Israelites. And Joshua sends 2 spies into Jericho to try and kind of scope out the land, to see what's going on so that they can take their plan of attack on the city, because this is part of their promised land. And as they enter the city, they encounter Rahab. And Rahab, again, lived near the city gates. So these 2 spies go to the home of Rahab. I don't know about you, but I think that's a little strange in this Bible story that these 2 men who were followers after God, followers after Joshua, go home with a prostitute to her house. However, things that kind of make a little bit more sense here is that she lived near the city gate, so they didn't have to wander the city. Had they wandered the city, they would have been captured. They would have found no information. So they go to her home because it seemed kind of normal for travelers to try to hide out, and they would have been captured because Israelites weren't welcome there. So they go to the home of Rahab, but word of their presence still spread to the king of Jericho. And we're going to pick up in Joshua 2, verses 3 to 5. And it says, "So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab. Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly, and you may be able to catch up with them." So Rahab instead had hidden the men on her roof. And she was trying to protect them because she knew something really important was going on with them. And so picking up at verse 9, she went up to talk to them and said, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea, and you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below." So Rahab basically confesses her belief in God. Rahab, who is pagan, has never believed in the Christian God before. She's immoral, she's non-Jewish, and she's a prostitute. She's basically a nobody here, and she's not familiar with the Christian God. But because of these Israelites, she has this newfound faith in God. She has this overwhelming sense of that God really is going to bring the Israelites into the promised land. And so she risks her own life. She risks the life of her family. She risks the little that she does have, which is basically just her life. She doesn't have a lot going for her, but she risks it because she wants to help these people, because she has this faith in God. And so she helps them. She gives them valuable information, and then she helps them out at night. She tapes this scarlet rope, wraps it around, and allows them to kind of escape out of their house, out of the wall. And then the Israelites tell her to use this same scarlet rope to tie over to her window, to leave it there, so that when the Israelites do come, they'll pass over her house and she'll be protected. Does that remind anybody else of anything? The Passover, yeah, it's real symbolic of that idea of protection of the Passover. And Travis mentioned that in week 1 as part of the end of the plagues in the Exodus, when the blood lamb was smeared on the doors and signified Passover, to pass over those houses that they were protected. So all this is going on, and about a week later, Joshua comes with their army, and they cross over the Jordan River. And there's some seriously ridiculous things that happen here that God did and that God asked the Israelite people to do as part of their journey. So they're walking across the river, and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they step foot in the Jordan River, and the waters part, and they have clear, dry land to walk on. Does that remind anybody of anything? The Red Sea, yeah, the parting of the Red Sea about 40 years earlier. So God does this again and gives Joshua a simple but very, very strange plan. And so if you've read this story before, I just want you to kind of visualize what God asked them to do. They're to march around Jericho, which is a large city, march around it once a day for 6 days. So they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and then there's 7 priests carrying ram's horns, and they're supposed to blow the horn as they march. And then on the 7th day, they're instructed to march around the city 7 times, blow one last trumpet, and they're all supposed to shout at the top of their lungs, and then the walls around them would come down. So this is the seriously ridiculous plan that God gives to the Israelites. But it worked. The really cool thing is when God gave this specific plan and said, do this, follow this path, this is what will happen, and it worked. And just kind of I've got 2 pictures for y'all. This is, if you care about this stuff, I just think it's really cool archaeologically. This is Jericho today, kind of that same area where we're talking about. And this is one of the most excavated sites in Israel today. Around this region of the country, it's one of the most popular. And starting in the early 1900s, archaeologists exposed a huge retaining wall that they believed went around the city. And there's at least 4 different separate excavation teams that found similar areas where there's been collapsed mud bricks that have fallen. So there's evidence that there was this huge wall and that some of the areas have been collapsed. So it tells us about the thickness of the wall that we know I was talking about was really thick where people lived in it, and that they're able to see where part of this wall has since come down. There's these collapsed bricks at the retaining wall. So it's just kind of really neat to see that mark in history and that there's evidence of that today. But after the city fell, Rahab joined the Israelites. She was protected. She joined in with those people and lived with them. And kind of coming back to her family tree, later on she married Boaz, and Boaz married Ruth. Or she had a son named Boaz, and Boaz married Ruth, and they had a son named Obed, who had a son named Jesse. And we've got a picture of just kind of this following. Does anyone know how many sons Jesse had? Oh, somebody said 9, somebody said 7. I believe it's 8. Had 8 sons, one of whom is David, and David, that train continues on to Jesus. So part of Jesus' lineage is Rahab, this prostitute. Somebody who had no influence, no wealth, no future, really no hope. She couldn't have there was no possibility of her progressing in life. But in Jericho, she had this reputation of being a prostitute. But following the Israelites, following God and having this faith in God, she had a totally new reputation. She was part of this saving plan. She was given a new name, a new label, and a new story to tell. And she's only mentioned a few short times in the Old Testament. And I think it's really cool and powerful when people in the Old Testament are picked back up in the New, and we hear about them again in the New Testament. So in Hebrews 11 is the first part where she's mentioned again. You might know what Hebrews 11 is kind of known for. When people talk about now it's up there. Faith? Yeah, faith. You think about the Hall of Fame for sports, Hebrews 11 is like called the Hall of Faith. It's called the Hall of Faith for people in the Old Testament, and they're mentioned here. And I just this is only verses 20 to 31. We're not going to read all this, but you see that Isaac, Jacob's up there, Joseph, Moses, and then picking up at verse 30 it says, By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. And 31, by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. So it's really cool that in Hebrews, even Rahab is mentioned, and she's hardly even in a full chapter, even in the Old Testament. She had nothing to offer, but what she did was kindness and protection. And she had faith in God's plan. And that faith saved her and gave her a new name. And then in James, she's also mentioned, James 2:14 to 25. And we're actually going to skip on to the next slide. I don't have time to read all of this. But this whole passage, anybody heard about kind of the difference? People kind of argue over this sometimes. Your faith is what saves you, or your works, what you do is what saves you. Has anyone ever heard that before? Yes. Yeah, in the Bible it talks a lot about you see both of these things, and people kind of interpret it differently. But we'll start off with verse 20. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? you see that his faith and his actions were working together. And his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. And we see here that it's not just faith, and it's not just deeds. It's not just works, the things that you do. It's not just going on a mission trip or loving your neighbor. And it's not just believing in God, but actually not ever doing anything about it. It's when these two things work together. It's when our faith prompts us to do good works, and that shows evidence for our belief. That's what James is talking about here. He's not saying that her being a prostitute is okay. He's not condoning that behavior, but he's saying Rahab did a really awesome thing. She believed in God and then acted on it. There's a lot of different things in this passage that we can learn. There's lots of messages for us. There's a message that sometimes God asks us to do really weird and ridiculous things, and then when we follow that plan, when we actually trust in God, great things happen. So we see that when they had to march around Jericho, some kind of ridiculous things that were asked of them. And we also learn how important it is for our faith and the things that we do to work together, to not just rely on our faith or not just rely on our kind acts, but to have faith in God and those things working together. But I think the fourth thing that is really important for us, and maybe the most important, is that we see that God works in the lives of people like Rahab. Somebody who, I don't know how many times I've said it, but somebody who is considered a nobody, somebody who is a prostitute, somebody who is living a life of sin. But God still worked through her. God still did amazing things in her life and redeemed her story. But maybe that's not you. Maybe you have felt like a nobody. Maybe you have felt ashamed before. But maybe you know people like that. Maybe you know people who are living a life of sin. Maybe you know people who have a bad reputation at school for being a partier or for just being not a nice guy or not a nice girl, whether it's true or not. Sometimes we fall into judgment of those people. That's what I was really thinking about when I was reading this story, how easy it is for us to judge people like Rahab and discount them and not think that God would really want to do something in their lives, not think that there's a chance for redemption, not think that there's a chance for change. So I think in this story, it's such a huge reminder of this seriously ridiculous love that God has for us and the love that he calls us to love other people like Rahab. We're going to close out in prayer, and then we've got one kind of thing to do after we pray, so just kind of stick around and give some instructions. If you want to grab a hand, we will close in prayer.